Welcome to the Crypto Layer HQ. Today I will be covering a method I like to use to manage risk in a portfolio. Oftentimes people measure assets only in their dollar denomination, and this isn't very useful oftentimes. For example, let's say you have a portfolio that has gold and silver in it. It can be useful to compare gold against silver, and it gives you a chart that looks something like this, where you can see when we're in the lower region that silver is most likely overvalued against gold. And when we're in the higher region, gold is overvalued against silver. Let's say you have a metals part of your portfolio that has 50% gold and 50% silver. As we approach the lower band, it could be a good idea to convert some of your silver into gold. For example, you could change your balance to 20% silver and 80% gold. And then as we approach this higher band region, you can then start to convert your silver back into gold and potentially own 20% silver and 80% gold. Since we can see oftentimes when we end up in this region up here, we eventually start to come back down, and once we reach this lower band region, we eventually start to go back up, test the lower band, and then we eventually test the higher band region. So this is a good method to know if you should be holding more of a certain asset against another one, and it makes more sense to compare assets that are similar to each other, such as gold and silver, since they're both precious metals. When it comes to crypto, for example, comparing ETH to Bitcoin is also useful. We can see when we're in this upper band region, it makes sense to convert any Ethereum you own into Bitcoin, since this means Ethereum is overvalued to Bitcoin. And then once we're in the lower band region, this can warrant potentially owning some Ethereum. But when we're in the upper band region, it makes absolutely no sense to be owning Ethereum instead of Bitcoin. As we can see, every time we reach these higher zones, we eventually start to bleed back down. And once we reach these lower zones, then it does make a bit more sense that you could add some Ethereum to your portfolio. Of course, depending on how much risk you want to take. But if we're not in this lower band region, it doesn't make sense to own any Ethereum. And then as we start to, eventually go up, potentially, then it starts to make sense to slowly start to convert your Ethereum back into Bitcoin. It's hard to know, of course, where Ethereum versus Bitcoin ends up topping out, but it's better to do it gradually over time. So even as we were rallying here, you could eventually convert some of your Ethereum to Bitcoin, and then as we just keep going up, you convert more and more and more. This, of course, depends on how much risk you want to be taking. If you want to take on more risk, then you can wait for higher levels to convert your Ethereum to Bitcoin. And same thing as when we go lower, because of course, we may never go as low as you would like to convert some Bitcoin to Ethereum. So you need to manage how much risk you're willing to take on. Another useful chart is Solana versus Bitcoin. We can also see once we got to this higher region that Solana was overvalued against Bitcoin. And if you owned any Solana, it made sense to convert it into Bitcoin. As you can see, we're bleeding back to Bitcoin, and we're probably going to end up reaching this lower band region. And once we're here, that could potentially warrant owning some Solana over Bitcoin. Of course, depends on how much risk you want to take. But when we're in these higher regions, it definitely doesn't make any sense to own any Solana, since we can see it's very overvalued against Bitcoin. So this is another useful way to know when to convert from one asset to another. Same thing with alts versus Bitcoin. We can see if you owned any altcoins, once we reach this upper band region, it made sense to convert all your alts into Bitcoin. And the only time it would warrant potentially owning alts again is once we're really in this lower band region. And of course, that comes down to how much risk you're willing to take on. But if we're not near this lower band region, it doesn't make sense to own altcoins, and you're taking on a lot more risk. For example, when we're in the middle or even up here, it makes absolutely no sense to own altcoins over Bitcoin. If we do end up rallying again in the future and we start to get even to this midpoint, it does start to become a good attractive point to start converting your altcoins back into Bitcoin. And the more we go to this higher region, it makes more sense to convert more and more of your alts to Bitcoin and eventually be fully in Bitcoin once we reach if we do end up going to these higher valuations where altcoins are overvalued against Bitcoin, since the same thing that happened previously will probably end up happening where alts end up bleeding to Bitcoin over the next few years. So this is a very useful way to manage risk in your portfolio. You can see which assets are overvalued against other assets, and it allows you to convert from one asset to another asset as opposed to simply looking at the asset's valuation in dollars, which can be much harder to predict. As we can see, for example, Ethereum, it's spent the last few years just going up and down, almost impossible to predict what's going to happen. Same thing with, even if you look at silver and gold, you're looking at just the USD valuations, it kind of puts you in a position of, okay, should I sell my gold or should I sell my silver? How much should I own of each? But when we look at this chart, it paints a much clearer picture that, okay, when we're in this region, it makes sense to sell some of your silver and own gold instead. And once we're in this higher region, it makes more sense to sell some of your gold and own more silver. Same thing with alts, paints a similar picture. Same thing with when we compare different specific altcoins to Bitcoin, we can see when it makes sense to convert back into Bitcoin to manage risk. And of course, this should be a gradual process. You shouldn't be converting 100% of one asset into another asset immediately. It should be a gradual process. So for example, as Solana was rallying here, as we got to the midway point, it would have been a good idea to start to convert a good portion of your Solana into Bitcoin, and then convert even more of your Solana into Bitcoin. And then once we reach this region, we can see that that's where we topped off the cycle prior. So this was very much a zone that it made sense to convert majority, if not all, of your Solana into Bitcoin.